Provided here are three different scatter plots. No context is provided to them, so we don't know exactly what types of variables we're comparing here, but we can talk about what we want to get at, the patterns that we want to identify when we investigate scatter plots. In order to investigate these patterns, we're going to read the graphs from left to right and then look to see if we can recognize any pattern in the points that are plotted. So if we start with graph 1, the first graph, as we look at this from left to right, we can see an increasing pattern. And if we wanted to, we could even try to draw a line that sort of fits that pattern. We won't hit all the points, but sort of passes through the general direction those points are headed in. So what we see is an increasing pattern because as we read the graph from left to right, the points all seem to be getting higher and higher. The y values seem to be increasing. The dots are relatively close to that line that we sketched in. Then if we move on to graph 2, we can see that we again have a pattern, but sort of the reverse pattern. Instead of the points increasing as we read the graph from left to right, they're following a decreasing pattern. So as we keep reading from left to right, we can sketch in this line that kind of approximately hits all those without necessarily really hitting any of them, just to give us the idea. As we move to the right, all of the y values are decreasing, the points are getting lower and lower. So we refer to this as a decreasing pattern. With the dots still being relatively close to that line that we sketched in. Now look back at graphs 1 and 2, the sort of clear, distinct increasing and decreasing patterns that we had, and compare that to what we see in graph 3. As we read the graph from left to right, there's no real clear distinction that the points, that the y coordinates are increasing, so the points aren't necessarily getting higher or getting lower. They're kind of just scattered around. There's some increase, there's some decrease, but it kind of jumps back and forth. So especially if we compare it to what we saw in graphs 1 and 2, in graph 3, there's no real pattern. So as we read the graph from left to right, they're not clearly increasing or decreasing. There's lots of spread. So we don't have the same kind of behavior that we're seeing in graphs 1 and 2. Now let's go back and talk about what these patterns mean a little more mathematically and some of the language that we attach to this. Going back to graph 1, we saw this increasing pattern. As we read from left to right, the y values are getting larger, and the dots were close to this straight line pattern. We refer to this as a strong positive association. So we link those words increasing and positive. This is a strong positive association because as x increases, as we read the graph from left to right, our y values are also increasing. That's the pattern that we see. In graph 2, we have this decreasing pattern, still points close to that straight line pattern. We refer to this as a strong negative association. In lots of contexts, positive means good, negative means bad. In this case, that's not how we're using those words. Positive means increasing, and negative means decreasing pattern. So in this case, we see a strong negative association, meaning that as our x values are increasing, as we read that graph from left to right, our y values are decreasing. So negative association doesn't mean a bad association. Still means a strong association. It's just the pattern. The values are moving in opposite directions. One's getting bigger while the other gets smaller. And then for graph 3, where there's no real pattern, we would say this is a case where there's no association, meaning there's no visible relationship between x and y. We'll start getting back into talking about graphs in context to see what it means to have that positive association, what it means to have that negative association, or what it means for there to be any lack of pattern. But these are the general cases that we want to pick up on. As we read from left to right, we see a relatively tight increasing pattern, decreasing pattern, or no real pattern. The points are just spread around with no real connection between the two variables.